He was supposed to spend the rest of his life behind bars, slowly serving out a 55-year sentence one controlled day at a time. But inside Wasco State Prison, that sentence didn't even last a week. 5 days after stepping through the gates, 66-year-old Agustin Duran was already fighting for his life, long before he ever met the cell he was meant to grow old in. What happened to him wasn't part of any court order. It wasn't scheduled, sanctioned, or written into the punishment the judge handed down. It was something far more sudden, far more brutal, and completely outside the system's control. A chain of events triggered not by chance, but by the reputation that walked into the prison ahead of him. Because inside Wasco, time doesn't unfold the way it does anywhere else. Decades can collapse into minutes. And the moment Duran arrived, a countdown began that no one warned him about, and no one bothered to stop. Stay close, because once you see how quickly his fate changed, you'll understand why some inmates never even make it to their assigned prison yard, and why his story turned into a sentence far more final than anything a courtroom could deliver. It happened in seconds. One moment, the dayroom at Wasco State Prison hummed with the usual background noise, footsteps, low conversations, the shuffle of men waiting out another evening. The next, that rhythm broke. A 66-year-old man went down hard, the impact echoing off the concrete as if the room itself reacted before anyone inside could. Witnesses later said the first hit landed with a sound you don't forget, the kind that tells everyone nearby that someone isn't getting back up the same way. Before officers could even process what they were seeing, the blows kept coming, fast, deliberate, delivered with the kind of force only a much younger man could generate. When staff finally reached him, Agustin Duran wasn't moving. His belongings were scattered, the room frozen in a stunned silence that always follows violence inside a prison. Medical personnel rushed in and fought to stabilize him as he drifted in and out, barely holding on. Within minutes, a helicopter was called. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow, and every second felt heavier than the last. But even as he was lifted toward that helicopter, barely alive, barely conscious, the danger he faced wasn't over. Surviving the assault didn't guarantee anything inside a place like Wasco, especially for a man carrying the kind of conviction that followed him everywhere he went. And the truth is, that collapse wasn't the beginning of his downfall. It was just the moment the rest of the world finally noticed what had been building from the second he arrived. Long before Agustin Duran ever stepped into Wasco, his reputation got there first. His conviction, an offense involving a child, carried a stigma that doesn't fade, doesn't get overlooked, and definitely doesn't go unnoticed once an inmate enters the system. Inside prison walls, that kind of charge becomes a second identity, one that walks ahead of you and shapes how everyone else decides to treat you. Duran's name had been sitting on public registry lists for years. His photograph was already circulating through local news reports. Anyone who cared enough to check could match the face to the offense in seconds. And in a place where information moves faster than official paperwork, that was all it took. Inside Wasco, inmates don't need to ask questions. They recognize names. They remember headlines. They notice when someone older, frailer, and carrying the worst type of conviction suddenly appears in their unit. Even if Duran had spoken to no one, his paperwork had already introduced him. And in a prison environment where hierarchy decides everything, from who gets protection to who becomes a target, his position was locked in the moment he arrived. Age couldn't save him. Silence couldn't hide him. Nothing could soften the weight of the label attached to his name. That label didn't just follow him into Wasco, it announced him. And once it spread through the unit, the countdown to what happened next sped up in ways no one on the outside ever sees coming. Wasco isn't built for stability. It's a reception center, a temporary holding zone where hundreds of men from every corner of the state are filtered, sorted, and moved like pieces in a system that never slows down. One day you're next to someone headed to a level 4 yard, and the next you're sharing space with someone who just came out of isolation. Faces change constantly, routines never settle, and safety, that depends on who's standing around you at any given moment. In this kind of environment, structure exists only on paper. In reality, the place runs on turnover. Officers focus on pushing people through interviews, medical checks, and classification steps as fast as possible. What they can't do is track every tension simmering inside a crowded unit where men from completely different worlds are suddenly forced into the same room. For someone like Duran, older, slower, unprotected, the timing couldn't have been worse. Reception units are the last place you want to be when your charges make you a predictable target. There's no established housing, no long-term cellmates, no protective routine. Just a constantly shifting crowd where judgment spreads faster than any official decision on where you're supposed to go next. And the moment he stepped into Facility B, he didn't blend in. He stood out, exactly the kind of person the reception system isn't designed to shield. But what made his situation even more dangerous wasn't the chaos itself. It was who happened to be placed in that same unit only days before. Inside any prison, paperwork travels faster than people. Charge sheets, registry printouts, transfer notes. These documents have a way of slipping into the unofficial networks inmates rely on. And once that information starts moving, there is no pulling it back. Duran's file held everything that mattered in a place like Wasco. His age, his face, and the exact offense that placed him at the bottom of the prison hierarchy. Even without speaking to a single person, his identity was already being decoded by the men around him. Someone recognizes a name from the news. Someone overhears a classification detail. Someone checks a public source when they get back from yard. It doesn't take long. Within hours, his reputation wasn't a secret, it was common knowledge. And that's where reception becomes unforgiving. In a stable yard, officers can isolate vulnerable inmates before rumors spread too far. But in a high-turnover unit, information outruns protection every single time. The moment the wrong person confirms what's in your file, your timeline inside that unit can shrink fast. For Duran, that clock didn't start when he was sentenced, it started the second his paperwork hit Facility B. From that point on, every hour he spent there was borrowed time, and everyone around him knew exactly what category he belonged to. His age didn't shield him. His frailty didn't matter. The label attached to his conviction overshadowed everything else. And while that information was circulating through the unit, another newcomer had already taken notice. A young man whose arrival 11 days earlier would shape everything that happened next. 11 days before Duran arrived, another inmate stepped into the same reception system, someone who couldn't have been more different from him. 19-year-old Andres Ion entered Wasco with a 6-year sentence for a robbery involving a weapon, the kind of charge that usually signals a rough adjustment period and a willingness to handle problems with force rather than conversation. He was young, fast, and already conditioned for confrontation. Men in his age bracket adapt quickly to prison life, especially in reception, where aggression often becomes a language of its own. And Facility B was full of people just like him, men serving long stretches, men coming off disciplinary transfers, men with reputations built on physical dominance. For someone like Ion, blending into that energy came naturally. When Duran walked into the same unit just 5 days after Ion's intake, their lives began sharing the same space, the same dayroom, the same unspoken tension that shapes every interaction inside a reception center. One man was decades past his physical prime, carrying a label that no one wants. The other was barely out of his teens, surrounded by peers who understood exactly how prison hierarchy works. Nothing in the official reports explains what ran through Ion's mind in the days leading up to the attack. But inside a place where reputation decides worth, and where new arrivals are judged before they even settle into a bunk, their trajectories moved closer and closer until they finally met in the worst possible way. Two inmates, opposite ends of the spectrum. One marked as a target, the other built for confrontation. And on a quiet evening inside Facility B, those paths collided with a violence no policy could stop. The evening inside Facility B was settling into its usual rhythm when everything broke. Around 7:20 p.m., with inmates scattered across the dayroom, Ion closed the distance between himself and Duran without hesitation. No warning, no words, just a sudden burst of violence that hit harder than anyone nearby expected. The first strike stunned the room. The next ones came faster, heavy, relentless blows that overwhelmed a man twice his age. By the time officers registered what was unfolding, Duran was already collapsing under the impact, unable to defend himself against someone almost half a century younger. Alarms exploded through the unit, sending everyone else to the floor. Most dropped instantly. Ion didn't. He kept swinging, ignoring commands, ignoring the chaos, locked into the assault as if he couldn't hear anything beyond his own momentum. Officers had seconds to react, and those seconds vanished quickly. A pepper grenade cut through the air, filling the room with a sharp cloud that forced inmates to stay down while staff rushed in. Even then, Ion resisted before being taken down and cuffed. The attack had lasted moments, just enough time to change Duran's fate permanently. When medical staff reached him, his condition was already critical. His breathing shallow, his pulse barely holding on. They moved fast, dragging him from the dayroom to triage, fighting to keep him conscious long enough for emergency transport. Outside, the yard lights washed over the landing zone as a helicopter touched down, blades cutting through the night. Duran was loaded aboard, but he was fading. And the truth is, once he left the ground, the outcome was already shifting toward something no one could reverse. His sentence was supposed to stretch decades. Instead, everything now depended on whether he survived the next few hours. The helicopter carried Duran to an outside hospital equipped for severe trauma, but the damage had already run deep. Doctors worked to stabilize him the moment he arrived, fighting against injuries that left little room for recovery. Through the night, his condition worsened, and by the next afternoon, the effort to keep him alive came to an end. At 4:48 p.m. on July 8, Augustine Duran was pronounced dead. Inside Wasco, everything shifted the moment that news reached staff. Protocol kicked in immediately. Evidence secured, statements collected, and the attack classified as a homicide. Ion was removed from the general population and placed into administrative segregation, cut off from the unit he'd been in for less than 2 weeks. Multiple agencies stepped in. Internal investigators reviewed the response timeline, how quickly alarms sounded, how fast staff reached the scene, whether force was used appropriately. Oversight officials monitored the process, making sure every procedural box was checked. And outside authorities began their own assessment, determining whether new criminal charges should follow the assault. But paperwork couldn't erase the central truth. Duran never made it past intake. He never reached a permanent yard, never settled into a long-term cell, never served even a fraction of the decades handed down in court. His experience inside the California prison system lasted just 5 days, barely enough time to unpack his state-issued belongings. And while the investigation tried to explain what happened, it couldn't answer the deeper question already forming in the background. How does a man sentenced to a lifetime behind bars lose that entire future in the very place meant to hold him? Because the events that ended his life didn't just reveal a tragedy, they exposed something far larger about the system meant to contain him. In theory, a 55 years to life sentence is designed to unfold slowly. Day after day, year after year, a long, controlled descent shaped by routine, rules, and time. But inside Wasco's reception center, that timeline never had a chance to begin. Instead, those decades collapsed into a handful of days, turned into something abrupt and irreversible. Reception centers are the most unpredictable corners of the prison system. Everyone passes through them: violent offenders, first-timers, men coming out of isolation, men heading into long-term placements. It's a constant churn where vulnerability doesn't get noticed until it's too late. And for someone with a conviction involving a child, the danger isn't theoretical. It's expected. Duran entered Wasco carrying every risk factor that reception can't absorb. A highly stigmatized charge, a frail physical condition, and an age that made him stand out the moment he walked into the unit. None of those things guaranteed violence, but together they formed a combination that the system has seen again and again. One that almost always ends badly when protection lags behind exposure. The courtroom imagined a slow punishment measured in decades. Wasco delivered something far more immediate, a version of justice the state never intended yet couldn't prevent. In the end, his story didn't follow the path outlined in his sentencing documents. It followed the unwritten rules of prison hierarchy and the chaotic machinery of reception life. 5 days inside that environment reshaped everything the judge believed would happen over the next half-century. And whether you see his death as an unavoidable consequence of who he was, or a failure rooted deep inside the system itself, the reality is the same. Duran never lived long enough to serve the sentence he was given. The system delivered its own verdict first. By the time the investigation wrapped and the reports were filed, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Agustin Duran never lived long enough to face the punishment the court intended. His decades-long sentence, carefully calculated, legally structured, and meant to stretch across the rest of his life, collapsed inside a reception center not built to protect someone like him. Some will say the outcome matched the nature of his crimes. Others will point to the system that placed an elderly, unprotected man in the same space as a volatile 19-year-old. Between those viewpoints sits the uncomfortable reality that no judge, no jury, and no courtroom ever envisioned. A sentence reduced to 5 days by forces no one acknowledged until it was too late. Duran's story isn't just about one attack or one inmate. It's about what happens when reputation outruns protection, when housing decisions move faster than safeguards, and when a system designed to contain danger ends up creating it instead. His case leaves a question hanging in the air, one the prison system wrestles with far more often than the public realizes. Was this justice delivered, or justice lost? Tell me in the comments what you think, because the answer says as much about the system as it does about the man who entered it.